Good afternoon. Today's webinar is a part of our But What Does It Mean series, a webinar series devoted to translating research studies data into meaningful action. Today's topic is 8161, a series on progress and barriers to racial equity in Greater Cleveland. Before we get started, I would like to take a moment to go over a few housekeeping items. My name is Joanna Brown, and I am the Director of Equity and Inclusion Programs at the Greater Cleveland Partnership. I will be serving as the moderator today for our series. We want to make sure today's presentation is extremely valuable for you, so we ask that you submit all questions by clicking on the question button in the control panel and typing your question. You may be wondering exactly what is 8161 and what can you expect from this series. Our speakers today, Benjamin Collinger, Program Manager, Brian Hall, Senior Vice President and Executive Director of the Equity and Inclusion Division, and Olivia Ortega, Director of Government Advocacy, will help answer these questions and more. And now I will turn it over to Benjamin Collinger to share his slides and a brief clip of the 8161 trailer. Benjamin?
Thanks, Joanna. I appreciate it, Joanna, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad that you're here with us today. I'm Benjamin Collinger, a program manager at the Greater Cleveland Partnership's Equity and Inclusion Division and a Venture for America Fellow. Many of you know that my work at GCP involves managing the Business Growth Collaborative, which is a 21 organization effort to help minority-owned businesses in Cleveland grow. Today, though, as Joanna said, I'm here to talk with you about a project called 8161, which is an original series from GCP. I'll give you a brief introduction to the project, present a slide on each of the 6 episodes, and then have an informal conversation with my colleagues Joanna Brown, Brian Hall, and Olivia Ortega about what it all means. We'll devote the rest of our time to questions from you. But before I jump into my presentation, I'd like to play a 1-minute preview for you so that we can kind of set the scene. So bear with me as I transition my screen to putting on our trailer.
Cleveland, Ohio.
People can't tell me that things can't be done.
Is Mr. Kucinich simply making political hay?
It's like being hit in the stomach.
We will make America great again.
Like crazy, beat my head upside,
It's 1981 and Ronald Reagan was just inaugurated. Cleveland is emerging from default. We're reeling from manufacturing losses and racial division abounds. But the Greater Cleveland Roundtable, a coalition of CEOs and community leaders, is searching for methods to regain their region's growth and struggling with how to include folks of color. 8161 reckons with their effort by exploring the organization's lost document archive to tell a story about where we've been in the last 40 years and how we might achieve racial equity in the next 40. Join us starting on June 7th for 8161, an original series from the Greater Cleveland Partnership.
All right, we are back. As you heard in the trailer, 8161 commemorates the Greater Cleveland Roundtable's 40th anniversary by exploring how far we've come since 1981 and how we might achieve racial equity in the next 40 years until 2061. When I heard about the Roundtable from my colleagues when I came to GCP a couple of years ago in 2019, I was really interested in the level of influence of the folks who came to its working sessions over the decades, and also what it said about how our city has developed. I went looking for old documents in all of the traditional places, the library, books, interviews, and so on. But the most important source was a document archive in GCP's basement, where I found meeting agendas and minutes, as well as a few audio cassette tapes of roundtable meetings. Although the impetus for this project obviously is the roundtable, you'll notice that that's not where it ends. We'll explore Cleveland's experience of unrest in the 60s, deindustrialization of the 70s, what many would consider a revival in the 80s, and how the roundtable reflected those changes. That brings me to the first episode, which is called No Seat at the Table. In this one, which Joanna helps to narrate, you'll learn that the roundtable started because a number of Black leaders didn't have a seat at the table of Cleveland's civic progress. And this episode tells stories about how those interests converged with some of the biggest companies in the city. We explore what led people like Carol Hoover and Dick Pogue to create the Roundtable and set the scene of where Cleveland found itself as it entered the 1980s. You'll hear about how a series of populist mayors, including Dennis Kucinich, really galvanized the business community to take leadership of Cleveland's development. At the same time, racial inequity was widening, and its symptoms like uprisings in Huff and Glenville became seen as liabilities for investment for businesses. In the second episode, we dive into a study that the Roundtable commissioned in the early 1980s and how folks like Mayor George Voinovich and the Reverend Otis Moss reacted when they heard the results. The key question that this episode, Race Relations in 1981, poses is this: if racism in 1981 was viewed primarily through the lens of race relations, did that focus on the role of individuals distract from the larger structural challenges that we faced? As I'm sure you can guess, in the third episode, I attempted to answer that question. American Dream to American Nightmare places the Roundtable's progress and challenges in the context of Cleveland's economic transformation in the 1980s and the Reagan Revolution. As with many of the episodes, I draw from meeting minutes where CEOs like Del DeWint of Eaton were unpacking the results of that race relations survey, and another about the progress of minority-owned businesses in the context of the region's loss of manufacturing jobs. Fourth is a story about labor and management, which turned out to be the Roundtable's most successful committee. As you might be aware, high wages and work stoppages were a huge impediment to big companies here in the 1970s. Labor and management were often in conflict, but the Roundtable became a significant forum which brought big union bosses like Jackie Presser of the Teamsters and Frank Valenta of the United Steelworkers to the same room or same table with their corporate counterparts, like David Hogue of LTV Steel. I use sound from an old cassette tape and an interview with Dick Pogue in this episode to describe why it was so important and get at the conflict that is inherent in this title. That conflict was a discontent for many of the Black members of the Roundtable, who wondered, how is this new focus on the biggest companies' labor management issues fundamentally helping minority workers and their businesses? Fights between labor and management had implications for workers of color, but obviously so does business ownership. So in the fifth episode of 8161, we explore the Roundtable's approach to understanding the barriers that many minority-owned businesses faced and tell the stories of a few entrepreneurs today. The focus of this episode is on businesses owned by Black women in our city, who are consistently the most entrepreneurial group in terms of starting new ventures. But Cleveland is still ranked as one of the least livable places for Black women in the United States. We also unpack some of the research about why Cleveland is so low on the entrepreneurial equity ratings in comparison to other cities across the country. Finally, the sixth episode, which Olivia helps to narrate, looks forward to 40 years from now. It explores how we've made predictions for the future before and what will happen with our city if we stay on the path that we're on right now. This is my favorite episode because it explains how many of the changes in our region's business community influence economic opportunity for all of us. I hope that folks see it as a call to action for more inclusive supply chains with minority-owned businesses at the center, intentionality in how companies create paths to promotion for employees of color, and how corporations can champion reforms based on their business models or the passion of their chief executives. Of course, I'm leaving out quite a bit from my presentation and keeping it short in the hopes that you'll listen to 8161 when it comes out. But with that, I'll transition to our panel with Joanna, Brian, and Olivia, two of whom have narrated parts of the series and one of whom participated in meetings of the Roundtable in the 90s and beyond, and is a critical leader to its continued effort in the form of GCP. So transitioning to my colleagues, and Brian, I'll ask you to kick it off. Tell me, what does it mean?
Thanks, Benjamin, and glad to be with you and everyone. Thanks for joining. Glad to join my colleagues to talk about the Roundtable. I guess the first thing I'll comment on is I've seen this presentation a few times, but I just noticed how much of the documents for the Roundtable were actually done with a typewriter. So that tells you how long ago we've been working on these issues. So very interesting to see the agendas typed up that way. I was one of the businesses that was invited to the roundtable somewhere in the late 80s or 90s. I guess as they were having that labor relations race discussion, they created a committee that invited minority businesses in to talk about their growth challenges, et cetera. And my company at the time, Industrial Transport, our family business, was invited to make a presentation. And so I saw the roundtable from a different perspective. And frankly, at the time, I wasn't really that impressed. I was, busy trying to grow a business, and I didn't really get how this group of well-intentioned folks were going to help me with what I was doing in Detroit and Chicago and St. Louis and other places. I was later asked to join the board. I can't remember how much later, probably around the 90s, after going through Leadership Cleveland, and began to work on how we connect the corporate community to minority businesses. In particular, was the interest of me and some of my colleagues that served on the Minority Business Growth Committee. So very interesting when you say, what does it all mean? And it's sort of the beginning of what became the Commission on Economic Inclusion. In between the Roundtable and the Commission on Economic Inclusion was an organization called MIAC, the Minority Economic Opportunities Center. It was funded by Cleveland Tomorrow with funds that were, I think, designated for the Roundtable, maybe left from something the Roundtable was trying to do. But it was an effort, again, to focus Cleveland on the economic issues, the business issues of wealth creation. And it had a 4 or 5 year run to try to do just that. So here we are, still working on these things 40 years later. I guess we'll have to listen to the whole series to truly understand some of the more in-depth meaning. But that's part of my perspective, having lived through some of it.
Thanks, Brian. Let's go to Joanna and then Olivia, and then we'll try to open it up as much as possible to the audience. But again, we want to just try to have as much of an informal conversation. So we really are relying on you, the audience, to ask us some questions about this. But before we do that, go to Joanna and then Olivia.
Sure. When I think about what does it mean, especially thinking about the episode that I narrated, what stands out to me is about the seat at the table. And I wonder, has it really changed? Has the more seats been expanded? Have people taken their chairs and developed their own tables? Just what exactly is going on there? Because we're talking about 40 years here. And so, over the course of 40 years here in Cleveland, obviously I was born. We won't say how long I had been born prior to the 40 years, but I was born. And it just gives me pause when I think about the different transitions that we've had in leadership, both in government, private, corporate enterprise, even philanthropy, because all three of those public-private partnerships drive the growth of Cleveland. They also drive the economic inclusion and economic valuation of Cleveland. And so thinking through, how has it changed? I'm looking forward to the series so that I can hear more of the background and I can learn more about the premise for where we are right now. But it's the table that stands out to me, and who are the players, and what is that table? Long and square? Is it multiple tables, round, where everybody can see each other? Nobody has a more advantageous position. Those are the things that I think about as we think about Greater Cleveland as a community and where we want to go. Not only where we want to go, but where do we want to be? Like, what are things that we can do right now to help improve economic inclusion?
Okay, I can.
I was going to call you out, Benjamin, because you said that Olivia's session was your favorite. I'm not going to. Right, I just want you to know that I did hear that in your script, and I'm okay. I'm recovering.
Well, no, I loved your episode too, but the conclusion hits differently. You know, it does.
All right, Joanna, maybe season 2.
It's all right. I'm not offended. I just, I'm recovering.
I can jump in there to talk a little bit about sort of my key takeaways, having narrated the last episode and seeing the evolution from the first to the end of the story. Well, not really the end, but where it sort of lands. I think in the first episode, or one of the earlier episodes, there was a quote that stood out to me by Carol Hoover, but Benjamin, please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm sure you have every line almost memorized, but she said something to the effect of, true economic inclusion it depends not just on, ensuring that Black voices are at the table, but also, and it goes beyond sort of the role of what Black Clevelanders can do, but it depends also in part on the willingness of the majority to fulfill the promises of the United States Constitution. And so, like, to me, it hearing that in the majority, meaning, those in power, white Cleveland, at the time, it struck a chord, because I've always sort of intuitively understood that inclusion isn't enough, but seeing the evolution of this particular story, where it started with the demand for a diversity of voices at the table, but where we landed wasn't necessarily true economic inclusion or progress. And it sort of supports this idea that simply bringing voices to the table and having a diversity there, it isn't enough. And it depends on many, many factors, but a lot of it, I think, lands on the majority of stakeholders, those that hold the power, that drive where the wealth in the community is going. It will require something of them in order to truly reshape what economic inclusion looks like in Cleveland. And simply bringing voices to the table, while it is crucial, it can't be the be all end all to solving these problems.
Thanks, Olivia. And I want to encourage folks to use the questions feature so that you can help drive this conversation. We really wanted this to be as informal as possible, but while we wait for that, Brian, do you have any reactions to that? Olivia's point is, yeah, the roundtable was a measure of diversity, but it didn't really include folks in the true decision-making of the direction of Cleveland. Do you have any reflections on that idea?
You asking me, Benjamin, or Olivia? I'm having a little.
Oh, yeah. Wondering what you think about those thoughts, and if you had other reflections on what Joanna and Olivia just mentioned. Looks like we might have some technical difficulties with Brian, so we'll go back to Joanna and Olivia. What else stands out to you all? Is there something that you're looking forward to people having a more detailed conversation about after this series comes out? Is there anything that maybe surprised you as you were working on it, or you thought, I'd really like people to understand this about our community that we don't understand right now?
I think there's a lot of really sort of sobering realizations that I had throughout listening and learning about this story. But one question in particular that I think GCP, is sort of uniquely positioned to address moving forward is this question of the corporate ties in the community at the time were sort of evolving. throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s to be, you know, arguably sort of less rooted in the community, and that had to do with, you know, a shift in the business climate and some mergers and CEOs moving out of Cleveland. But that was my takeaway, that there was sort of there was less of an appetite, I think, to be sort of involved and courageous around what was happening within Cleveland and within urban affairs in the city. And so I just wonder, you know, with everything that we see today, with remote work increasingly, you know, here to stay, what does that mean for the leaders of our business community now? What does their commitment look like, and how do we as GCP, you know, help strengthen those ties?
Great, thanks, Olivia. Joanna, thoughts on that?
Yeah, so, you know,
no digit, please re-enter your headset.
I'm hearing like some background, so making sure that when I think about the community of Cleveland, I'm curious to see what stayed the same, not what's changed. Because I think we often point out the small incremental change that we've made, but I don't think we really have shined a spotlight on, you know, yes, we have been working toward economic inclusion and toward bringing people to the table, and towards some semblance of change, but where are we stagnant? And where have we kind of parked, and we're just kind of churning in the mud? Because those could potentially be opportunities where we can coalesce together and move forward. So I think identifying some of those areas and really being able to understand more about what do we want to work on? Because public will, we're not doing anything without public will. I think that we found that, you know, I mean, thinking about the pandemic provided a lot of opportunity for us to do things that had been previously said couldn't be done. And not only do it, but do it expeditiously, as well as in excellence. You know, it's got refined over time. I mean, this series is something that we didn't have before, but each time we do it, the amount of people that join in from the areas that they're joining in from, and we're reaching people that we had not reached in the past. And so it's becoming this, we're a year in, this is actually our 1-year anniversary, you know, of a But What Does It Mean series. And so I use this just as an example of something that you start, you try to refine as you go along, but you don't stop. And I think in Cleveland, we have a lot of great starts. Like starting, we can get out the gate. It's the coming around the corner, you know, that last little finish line, you know, just holding on till we can cross, you know, the actual tape, the ticker tape. And so if we can, as a community, do that consistently and often, I think that the community will be more attractive to people, where it draws people into Cleveland instead of repelling people away from Cleveland. You know, economic inclusion and diversity and how the community operates as a whole is very attractive. People want to go where they're welcome. And I think that Cleveland has a lot of components that do this, but if we can pull them together, we can go very far, especially by 2061.
Thanks, Joanna. Brian, the question that we were responding to was thinking about what will people be surprised by when they listen to this series? What do you really hope people take away from it, knowing that there's a lot of cliches in the way that we describe economic inclusion. There's a lot of kind of hand waving about where we've been over the last 40 years or 60 since other things have happened in our country, or even the last year since George Floyd was murdered. So how would you kind of frame what people should be looking out for as they listen to this series?
Thanks. Sorry, I lost internet connection for a while there. I could sometimes hear and sometimes couldn't, but happy to be back. You know, I heard most of Joanna's comments and a little of Olivia's, and it goes back to, I think, Joanna, your comment about the table. But the idea of what hasn't changed is an interesting one, and I think also a challenging one, because when we use the term economic inclusion, we are often referring to a group that's in power, including those who aren't in power, or group that's acceptable, including those who aren't accepted. And I wonder, in terms of things that haven't changed, this will sound a little controversial, and I'm not trying to blame the fish, but do we do any self-examination about things that haven't changed? And an example is, for me, the Black Lives Matter movement and the organization that the group of people put together, in some ways decentralized, but focused. And it was setting a new table, quite frankly. We're not asking to be included. We're going to develop our own table and our own agenda. And after George Floyd, the number of signs in my neighborhood of how Black Lives Matter are people who are now joining their table versus them being asked and trying to get at someone else's table. And so I think that's one example for me of what can the unincluded do to create inclusion, not just what can those in power do to create inclusion. And I realize, you know, when you're in a system that has a lot of built-in mechanisms, there's only so much that you can do without getting the system to change also. So I'm not suggesting we could change it on our own. But over the last 40 years, if you think about some things, education levels or education attainment, or maybe even the embracement of a certain set of values that our community had because we were being, the exclusion was so obvious. It became so subtle that some of us may have gotten a little comfortable and then decided we didn't have to fight as much or as hard. And so I would say over the last 40 years, we may have lost, we as in the community of people trying to be included, may have lost our steam in a way. And BLM to me was an example of a new generation and a new steam being formed and a new focus being put on that we hadn't seen since the 60s. And we certainly hadn't seen the worldwide embracement of things that they hadn't changed. A lot of things hadn't changed, but all of a sudden they were being acknowledged. So not to dismiss any of our other work, it's just one of those things that I think about. And I'll just close. I was in a session with a group of Black professionals a few years ago who were talking about, you know, what can we do? How can we push forward, et cetera? And one person said, and he didn't get a lot of love for his comment, but one person said, we might want to focus internally on what are the values of our community and how do we build something that doesn't require somebody else to give us something? How do we build? No one can take away, you know, what you value and how you work together as a community. There's things that you could do that doesn't require anybody else. And I thought it was an insightful comment that if we could do both, it might help us get there. So I'll stop there.
Can I tag in?
Tag in, you're in.
So Brian, you know, I love that concept of building our table, you know, especially in various communities, Black, Latino, Asian, building our communities and building infrastructure to not need other communities to come in and rescue or to come in and make space. My my challenge with that is that, just from African Americans, we've done that multiple times. And in doing so, the larger our communities become, just take Tulsa, just take even Move that happened in Philadelphia. There is a visceral reaction to us growing. And so it becomes a matter of, I don't think that the will to grow, the will to do these things in our community, both on the business side and as community advocates, is not there. It is, how do we, even in Cleveland, how do we in Cleveland begin to actually celebrate and embrace those kind of initiatives where it actually is a feeder for other things and not a threat? Because it gets, to me, perceived as a threat, and then there is the personal livelihood that is impacted. There's the place, the neighborhoods that are decimated. You go through, I mean, here in Cleveland, we had a lot of areas where African Americans thrived, and they had whole communities. The Glenville area is one of them. Now you drive through and it's like, I'm driving through a wasteland. What happened? And it's not a slight on the people that are still there. It just becomes this, it's like almost a machine turns, and it's like a spotlight, like how can we cannot have that grow. And so it's almost like, weeds growing through concrete. How do we address this? Is that something that can be addressed through like the Greater Cleveland Partnership and our collaborations that we have? Because I'm like, I want to get behind it, but at the same time, my muscle memory is very long. I don't want to keep building in order to have it destroyed. I mean, you, Brian, you were sharing about historical opportunity, historical discrimination in the housing market, where your father and his partner got together and built the whole community in the Lee Harvard area of homes that people could come and build. And it's like, how we have to keep, it's almost like you got to keep doing that. And then it doesn't seem like it's hard to hold on, to me, to the bright spots, because the burnt spots, the burn marks are very real and painful.
No argument here. Olivia,
Yeah,
you were going to say something.
No, I appreciate those comments. I think my inclination is always to put more of the responsibility and the impetus on the majority, and on the folks that have benefited from just, immense wealth and privilege in this country, because I think it will truly, and maybe perhaps this is where our organization can play a role, is in shifting that culture of either feeling threatened or scared or snatching back when we have communities of color that are building wealth. I don't know, I think it's a really, really good question, Joanna. I don't know how we begin to dismantle that. But I do think it will require willingness and real decisions. Like, when the rubber meets the road for white people, what are they choosing to do that will not sort of perpetuate the racist outcomes of across a lot of different sectors. And I think that those micro decisions really, really, really matter. And there are thousands of them. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that at all, but it is something that I certainly tend to put more of the, I tend to put more of the emphasis on the role of those that have not been historically excluded in the small decisions that continue to perpetuate economic exclusion.
Yeah, no argument from either of you. That's why I was trying to be careful, even as I make my point, because we cannot fight the system. The system is what the system is, has to be changed. We can, but there are some things I think we also can't overlook that can help us in our fight against the system. And so that's all. My only point was to your comment, Joanna, about if you look back over 40 years, what's still the same? There are some things that our community, I mean, you mentioned Lee Harvard. Lee Harvard, when I graduated John F. Kennedy High School, the high school was #2 to Shaker in terms of national honor scholars in that community. And that was in a school that was found 2 years later to have been discriminated against. If you compared John F. Kennedy to West Tech in terms of resources, in terms of investment, in terms of books, in terms of programs, it was one of the 19 counts that the school system was found guilty on discrimination. But as you use the weed in the concrete, we grew flowers in the concrete because we had a determined community that had been through so much together that frankly, a lot of them probably moved from Glenville to get to Lee Harvard, to these new homes and this new community, and had this spirit of trying to grow a community and succeed that was in part in spite of everything. And so I'm not excusing the system at all, but I am saying in addition to that, examining what we might do, how important it is that we push for excellence, how we come together towards that. And to your point, we build them and then something happens. We get torn down and we got to have a muscle memory for that. And you can find that all throughout our country. But really, I was just pointing it out as another element that we don't often examine as we talk about inclusion. And in all fairness, I'm with you, Olivia. There's just so much, thousands of things that need to be addressed. That's where the focus has to be, because that's where the change is going to happen. I mean, our country was founded when they decided to throw the tea in the harbors and said, we're not going to deal with it anymore. Real system change, and you know what came after that.
Well, team, I think we've got about 20 minutes left, so I'm going to start getting to our audience questions. And there are a couple of them about next steps and what we hope the business community does with the series, which I'll ask to you at the end. But before I do that, I'll get to some of the others that we have up here on the chat. So one person, Ivanka, actually asks, I'd love to hear about your thoughts on the concept of a table as a place where dialogue, collaboration, and diplomacy take place. Can a dialogue between different actors who all have different levels of power ever be equal? What does it mean to bring the work of social justice to a table instead of, say, a public space or protest? Any thoughts on that, guys?
First of all, hello, Ivanka.
No, hey.
You know, that table setting is coming up again. I don't think you can have an equal conversation just being at the table if the power at the table is different. It just doesn't work. That's not to say we shouldn't have either different voices at the table or a different table, but the intent of the table has to be real exchange and action. You know, we heard last week that our public sector is forming a table, probably already formed, to think about how to best utilize the federal funds. And the mayor has been very specific that those funds, besides shoring up everything that COVID cost the city, the other emphasis for him was eliminating racism, creating equity, and eliminating classism. So if that is the mission of the table, who should sit there and who has the power to make that happen?
I
And that's a
think,
question. I don't have the answer for it.
yeah, Brian, building off of what you are saying, hi, Ivanka,
Mhm.
I think that power is relative, and that you have different types of power. Some people have, like fiduciary power. They have the power in terms of financial power, but you can have all the money in the world and still not be able to affect change. I mean, we've seen that in different areas in the city. So there has to be a welcomed partnership with people who have influential power, who can actually influence not only the business community, but the actual communities where you want the change to occur. And change can occur without talking with the community. I'm reminded of Midtown, a community development corporation here in Cleveland, who I cannot remember exactly where it was, but they have recently done some upgrades to their area. And in order for them to do it, they have been very intentional about keeping the community involved and at the table. So it is not just people who see an idea, see an issue and want to solve it, but the ideas and the solutions are formed with awareness and understanding of the people that actually live there and can give them greater context to help refine the solutions that they have. And to me, that's the table, right? Right now, the table is digital. It can be as big or as small as we want it, but I think it definitely is a place where power is shared, and there is, higher education is supposed to have a shared governance structure. Perhaps this is something that we can employ here.
That being said, I think I'll go on to another question that we have from another one of our colleagues, Michael Elliott. He says, Black and brown people have gained significant influence and power politically and socially over the last 40 years within city administration, like the White and Jackson administrations, city council, and the nonprofit community. Millions of dollars have poured in from federal, state, local, and the philanthropic and nonprofit community to support minorities, specifically Black communities and businesses. Why has this growing influence and the dollars not translated to economic uplift? What tables are Black and brown communities not being included in or invited to exactly? Are there other factors at play outside of real or perceived lack of racial inclusion? I'm hoping the podcast sought out diverse perspectives as to why economic inclusion is lacking. Any thoughts?
Well, I think, Benjamin, you should answer the last part of that, if you, whether or not you sought out a diverse perspective.
Yeah, well, Michael, I think that the answer that I would give to you is that this is really a story about Cleveland's economic transition over the last 40 years and how each of those economic transitions impacts people of different races differently. The manufacturing losses that we talk about and are kind of a really important part of our civic culture and understanding of who we are economically really impacted Black workers and Latino workers far more than it impacted white workers. I'm reading this book that's about Pittsburgh, which is very similar to Cleveland in the ways that it developed, and it's actually a book about how the manufacturing losses gave way to a prosperous healthcare sector because we had all these workers and such a ill population that we needed a strong healthcare sector to basically build back up the community. But one point that this author makes is that a lot of the lowest skilled jobs were only occupied by Black laborers, even though many of those Black folks had skills that they could use in other places, but they were systematically excluded from those jobs. So I really want us to have a conversation about what does that look like today? What are the skills and competencies that Black folks, Latino folks, other people in our community that are not white, what are the skills that they're not being allowed to use because they're shut out of a bank loan, because it's harder for them to get a promotion because of how they look, because of the way that a company does their supplier diversity practices, or whether a company that hires a chief diversity officer actually gives that person power to do some stuff with their company, right? So it's all kinds of stuff. And obviously, as a business chamber, our concern is how can we help our members to realize the economic gains from racial inclusion? So it is a lot of things. And I think, Michael, you're right to point out that there is a lot of money dedicated to these causes. But, we can't really comment on the public sector. We can say what we're trying to accomplish here is to set a scene of where the business community, where the private sector has been in the last 40 years, and say, how can we look internally and understand how companies influence this? So, I think, Michael, we can talk offline about what the government has to do with this, but I'd really like us to encourage each other to think about what does all of this look like within our own businesses and how we work every day.
I mean, you knocked it out the park.
Okay, well, that's
No,
one
I
answer.
think Brian was trying to say. Brian,
Oh
were you
yeah,
trying
go
to
ahead,
say?
Brian.
Yeah, you did a great job, Benjamin, and it is a perplexing national, not just Cleveland, problem when you look at the gains that have been made politically and how they haven't translated to economic benefit. But I would just make one point. Before integration, our dollars were spent in our community because they couldn't be spent anywhere else. And that supported a certain level. And to your point, those dollars were being derived from middle class manufacturing opportunities that created that. I mentioned Lee Harvard. If you think about Lee Harvard, I could go through and I lived on the street with 19 families. I could tell you what the husbands and wives did, all middle class jobs. But after integration, and I've often argued franchising, that the dollars in the Black community left and the dollars in the white community never came. So it was a one-way street to economic peril. All of our dollars went out and no dollars came back. And that's when supplier diversity even became a part of the language, was in the 70s. But if you think about the mom and pop, and I hate to even call it, think about the restaurants, the dry cleaners, the gas station. There were three gas stations in the neighborhood I grew up in, two of them owned by Black men, a hotel, small stores, and franchising eliminated much of that. And who got the franchises, at least initially? It was a number of years before a program started allowing Black and Latinx families to buy into the franchise system. So there was a big whoosh sound of our dollars, along with the loss of the middle class jobs happening at the same time. So I would argue or not argue, but to answer Michael's question, and he knows this from being at Cleveland Neighborhood Progress, that neighborhoods got decimated. That's what happened to Glenville, Joanna. It wasn't that, it was that combination of economic wins, some of which we were responsible before where we spent our dollars, but some of it there was no choice. I mean, there were no big box stores. Malls showed up in the 70s and 80s. Everybody rushed to the mall. How many of the stores in the malls were owned by Black people? Where were they spending their money before that? So there's a combination of systemic things that, to the earlier point, we are trying to climb uphill against, and we've got to knock some of those big blocks down.
I think that aligns with the question by Arian, who says, I believe that percentages and quotas have been a plus, but unfortunately, I think they have caused a false sense of inclusion that did not create sustainability and longevity with minority businesses. And Brian, I think that your comments on that are quite clear. Anything else? Olivia, would you like to add to that? It's hard to not be the moderator.
We went into moderator mode. Wow.
No, I I think that was really well put, Brian. The only thing I will say, I know we can't comment on the public sector, is that there's always room for more Latinx representation there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I hope you guys get a better return on your investment. Which was, by the way, another point I was going to make. The last City of Cleveland election, there was an 18% turnout.
Yeah, it's so much to unpack there. I mean, you know, we don't even have time, Brian. We can't go.
Right. I wasn't even going to comment on what that means, but 18%. That means,
wow.
You know, that means any of us as a block could elect somebody if we all did it together.
Wow.
Well, I think that kind of speaks to the collective action problem in this city, right? People aren't really willing to go after something that they believe in or really commit to the action steps that make something happen, even though there is clearly a kind of critical mass of folks who agree with an idea, right? And that's the case with what the roundtable was trying to do. It's the case with why we have such low voter turnout. And it leads us, I think, to the last topic of this, which is answering questions about what the next steps are. So some of our colleagues are asking, how do you plan to engage the business community with the podcast series? How will they engage with the ultimate call to action? And while you're thinking about that, let me just give you a little bit of context. There's this one part in the third episode, American Dream to American Nightmare, where I'm unpacking the way that some of the CEOs of the biggest corporations reacted in the 80s to the race relations 1981 survey. Del DeWint of Eaton and Stanley Pace of TRW were planning to present the results of that survey to 45 CEOs of the biggest companies in the region. And I kept looking for the results of that meeting. And the only reference I could find of that meeting, first of all, there were no notes of it, even though I have, pretty excellent, I have a binder full of, I have like 6 binders, 10 binders of these, right? I can't find any of it. There's no record of what happened after that meeting other than a person saying, I'm wondering if there's going to be some follow-up to that meeting where the CEOs heard about the problems that we have in this community and what we can do about it. And Brian, right, we had a meeting just like that a couple weeks ago.
Just last week.
The same audience, right, with the same audience. And I don't know that it was very different. So what do you think? What do you think we're going to do differently this time?
Oh, I was going to comment to your point, or the point of the question. The Greater Cleveland Partnership is the business community. It represents 13,000 businesses, including most of the larger businesses. So in terms of engaging them, they are at least indirectly, if not directly engaged. They fund our work. They funded this project. We try to do everything we can to create awareness. And then last week, the session we had with 45 or so CEOs. Can I promise things will be different? Of course not. But I can promise they won't be the same. There will be some differences. And that's because hopefully we learned something through the last 45 years, because there's been many of those meetings since that Del DeWitt meeting. And I think the problem is we end up doing things incrementally. But the one thing I hope we're doing now that we may not have done as forcefully as we needed to in the past is just what I said earlier about not allowing people to blame the fish. So we don't get there because we got to fix the fish. When the fish would swim and, live a wonderful life if their water wasn't polluted. So let's fix the water. And I think in our new co-chairs and Chris Gorman and Bill Lacey, there's more than just an ambition to make that happen. I think in our new CEO, there's more than just an ambition. We're talking about problems that grew out of 400 years of history. So I can't expect I mean, even the changes that we do make, they're so incremental based relative to the complex problems, but just relative to that particular one, I won't set out what the objective is now, but there is a focus and an objective that creates some accountability. Big question for me, and Joanna, you said this about the community and accountability, and the CEO wrote this to me last weekend as a result of that meeting last week. And he had excellent points, but one of his points was set the objectives and hold the community accountable. And somebody has to define for me, who is the community that we're going to hold accountable? And how are we going to hold them accountable? So at Benjamin, that's the feedback I got from last week's meeting, and several people were copied and amen, but we got to answer that question. Who is that community that we're going to hold accountable, and how do we hold them accountable?
I would add that each community has its own agenda. And so I think if we are able to address the notion that solutions do not have to be one size fits all, I think that is our way of trying to address a lot of things. Oh, I did it this way, I'm going to now turn and do it that way with this community. And it doesn't take root the same way. It doesn't provide sustainable change. And if we are able to be adaptive in our recommendations, adaptive in our approach, and stay in the learner's pose of, hey, this is a lifelong experiment. We will always, because the needs of the community will change. And so we can't be stuck in this mindset that, oh, well, I solved that and I gave community development dollars to a community, they built homes, I'm on to the next. Oh, well, 10 years later, they still need money. Well, things happen in those 10 years. So how do we plant something in the sand to, where we hit bedrock, but that we're also shoring up the bedrock as we go along, and providing needed maintenance on the issues, which I don't think that we do, which is why we end up in these situations continually.
I think to the extent that GCP and that we can use this podcast as a starting point for these types of conversations with the business community is something that will help us figure out how do we support business leadership in having the courage to tackle some of these very complex issues in our community. How do we support, how do we accelerate that? How do we elevate those voices that do have a significant amount of power or influence to turn the tide in issues like the digital divide or affordable housing or any X number of issues? I see this as, a great window into that type of conversation, but also for us as an organization to figure out, what is our role in doing that, in doing that more, in partnering with business leadership to elevate and to put the spotlight on issues, to try and solve issues, in a sense, to hold accountable leadership to address issues that ultimately are affecting like the economic resiliency of our community anyways. I see it as a good starting point for that. And I hope that we as an organization can engage with business leadership using the podcast as a tool, another way to start the conversation around that.
Thank you. Wow, time goes so fast when we are having fun. And so I want to extend a sincere thank you to you, Benjamin, for being the producer of 8161 and for all the work that you've done on this project and being very thoughtful and inclusive about how to engage our audience and our business community around this topic. Thank you to Brian and Olivia. Always a welcome time. I wish we, next time we take this show on the road, we might have to, be at a table or something. We got to find maybe a blue table talks or something. Well, what I want to do is just thank you all for sharing such great information and insight with us today. And thanks to all of the participants for being a part of the webinar today. We hope you found this webinar engaging and informative. If you have any additional thoughts, please feel free to share them. Let us know. We have an opportunity for you to find out more information about the 8161 project by visiting gcpartnership.com/8161. This concludes today's session. Thank you.